Historiography. Grapho in Greek means to write, so it simply means writing history. Unless you think that the world really doesn't exist at all, which none of the people in our history really believe, there is a history. But then, whatever really happened on a material or spiritual plane, whatever really happened, is mediated to us. In other words, your time machine is missing a part or something. We have to go through history. We have to go through historiography. So you have the history, the facts themselves. Then someone wrote things down, what they believe happened. And then here we are. So we're looking back at history through this medium, which is historiography. And of course, it may or may not be accurate. And we won't get into a whole postmodern thing about, objectivity. There's a whole discussion going on in our civilization about can you be objective, and if you conclude, of course, that you can never be objective, then the obvious question is that an objective fact? So it's like never say never. Negative absolutes always kind of run out of gas at a certain point. Like never say never. You can't be objective, so that statement is not objective, so back to square one. Anyway, the reason I went into that little spiel is because we're going to look back through historiography at Buddha, at his name, first and last name. Apparently, his name was Siddhartha Gautam. Siddhartha is a common name. There's a famous book by Hermann Hesse, Siddhartha, based on that. Siddha. Siddha in Sanskrit means perfected or accomplished, and artha means a purpose. So one whose purpose is accomplished, one whose goal in life is perfected, or whatever. That's Siddhartha. Gautama is from a sort of an ancient Brahmin name. It's a prestigious name of Brahminical community. So Siddhartha Gautama. They didn't have sort of modern academic historians back then. In fact, if you know European history, after Newton, after the Newtonian Revolution, when Newton showed people that actually there's some rhyme and reason to the universe, there's some logic to it, it's hard to exaggerate the effect it had on Western civilization. It changed everything. Because until Newton, in a sense, the easiest way to say it is, until Newton wrote his thing, basically people in the West lived in Middle Earth. That's the best way to think about it. In other words, almost everyone in the Western civilization lived in Middle Earth, in a world in which there were, little trolls under bridges and fairies and things like that, and the planets spin around and make music as they spin, and of course we don't know that that's not true. Anyway, suffice it to say that before Newton, people lived in Middle Earth, and post-Newton, everyone wanted to live in a logical Newtonian universe. In fact, it was held that the more you could show the logic of the universe, the more you showed the glory of God, because obviously it's a rational intelligence which produces a rational universe. In any case, every field was affected by it. For example, the study of society had to be scientific. Therefore, people started to ask questions like, why is that guy or that girl sitting on a throne, and why are they so rich, and why do they rule us? Is that scientific? Is it scientific for someone to be a king or a queen and someone to be a peasant? And psychology, everything had to be scientific. And one of the things that had to be scientific was history. History had to be scientific. So to use a German term, used to Wissenschaft, the science of history. And so if you look at pre-Newtonian history, history was perceived as a vehicle to convey wisdom. That's why you sat down and took out your little quill or whatever and wrote history. It was to convey wisdom. So if you look at the ancient Greek historians like Herodotus or even Virgil in Rome or the people in India, it didn't matter if you got all the facts precisely right. It was the wisdom. It's like if you're writing a poem. Let's say you're writing a poem about spring. And it doesn't matter like which spring. Do you mean 2006 or 1839 or what day of the year was it, what time of the day? That's not the point. There are certain universal characteristics of spring, and if your poem conveys springness, sort of a deep insight into what it feels like to be in the midst of spring, that's a good poem. That's a good take on spring, not modern meteorology. So anyway, we tend to do, certainly in the University of Florida, it's a public university, a secular public university, history is supposed to be post-Newtonian scientific history. Now, anything which doesn't come within the realm of, let's say, sort of a crude concept of empiricism, and most scholars have an extremely crude concept of empiricism because they're not trained in epistemology. If you get a degree in science or even a degree in history, you do not necessarily study epistemology, and therefore they tend to be kind of crude about certain assumptions like that's mythology and that's science and so on. So we live in a world in which there's sort of a somewhat crude, somewhat ideological notion that this is scientific history and this is mythology. Now, going back to the Buddhist ranch, vegetarian ranch for now, we have all this history because all we know about the historical Buddha, basically, or almost all we know, comes from historians who had a pre-Newtonian concept of history. Their goal was to convey wisdom and the glory of the Buddha. So there we go. So who was Buddha really, and what did he really do? What did he really say? Well, I've done a little preface, so that's the question. So I want to read you some quotes from our reading, then we'll talk about the historical Buddha. Here's something from the Macmillan Encyclopedia of Buddhism, if you can trust them. According to tradition, the Buddha's discourses were already collected by the time of the first council, which was just after his passing, when they thought we better get together and figure out where do we go from here now that Buddha's gone. So held shortly after the Buddha's death. Scholars, however, see the texts. In other words, there are certain texts that claim to be sort of transcripts or the documents of that council. Scholars see the text as continually growing in number and size from an unknown nucleus. An unknown nucleus. In other words, by the time these things get written down, by the time it all gets collected, there's many different versions, scholars say actually we have texts from many different and later periods, and they've grown, and we don't know what the original text was. You find the same issue, for example, we'll get it in a month or two, to the Mahabharata, the great epic of Hinduism, where all the greatest scholars in the world threw up their hands and decided we can't go back to the original core text from which everything sprung. So the same case of Buddha. They believe the text from an unknown nucleus underwent various changes in language and content. Here's from our little book, The Summary on Indian Philosophy. Notwithstanding the free circulation of many popular stories based on the Buddhist traditions, didactic and hagiographic narrative, that means teaching and stories about saints like Buddha, we have no certain facts regarding the Buddha's early life. This is, of course, from the post-Newtonian, scientific, academic, historical perspective. We have no certain facts regarding the Buddha's life, early life, except that he was born into a family who lived in the town of Kapilavatthu, and that it seems likely that the family was well-to-do with high connections. Of course, yes?
You said that Goswami was like a popular Brahmin name?
Yeah, exactly. He was supposed to be born in a warrior family.
Well, I thought he was Shastra.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. But somehow or other, it's like everyone named Goldsmith nowadays isn't a goldsmith.
Okay.
So,
Makes sense.
yeah. In fact, hardly anyone named Goldsmith today. Exactly. Anyway, not to speak of Miller and Cartwright, which was a card maker, of course. Paul Cartwright. So, references, this is from our book, Short Introduction to Buddhism. References to the royal status of the Buddha's father, Suddhodana, are most likely an exaggeration. Another quote. The most famous and elegant account of the Buddha's life, the most famous, is an epic poem, the Buddha Charita, which means what the Buddha did. Composed in the 1st century A.D., so we're almost like 500-600 years later. Composed by the famous Buddhist literary figure Ashwaghosh, which means literally horse proclamation. Anyway. So a certain amount of information is preserved in the Pali Canon, so the earliest written sources, because at the time of Buddha, people don't write in India. At least there's no evidence of writing. The first writing we have in India is about 2,300 years ago. I already mentioned that. engravings of the Emperor Ashoka when he was trying to promote Buddhist doctrines a few hundred years after Buddha. So a certain amount of information is preserved in the Pali Canon. Pali is like a Vulgate dialectic or of Sanskrit, some kind of like Latin to Italian. It's actually, it sort of, if you know Sanskrit, it sort of sounds like Sanskrit with a Brooklyn accent. But anyway, that's the way it is. So, but no attempt was made to piece the details together of his life into a continuous narrative until about 500 years after his death, because people didn't write biographies back then. Biography, in fact, one of the first biographies, perhaps the first autobiography that we have in the world is that of St. Augustine, his Confessions. And that's long after Buddha. It's actually about almost 1,000 years after Buddha, 800 or 900 years after Buddha. So the concept of biography, furthermore, is a comparatively recent Western invention, didn't exist then as a literary genre. So similar difficulties have beset attempts to construct biographies of other early religious figures such as Jesus. And it is unlikely that a quest for the historical Buddha would meet with any greater success in the quest for the historical Jesus from the point of view of Western academic historiography. Images of the Buddha, such as the one that the Taliban blew the feet off of in Afghanistan several years ago. These huge Buddhist statues, which are famous from East Asia and other parts of the world, actually, they didn't exist until about 200 AD. So that's 700 years after the historical Siddhartha Gautama. Before then, he was represented in art through symbols such as a tree, a wheel, or a parasol. If you know Spanish, parasol for the sun, and so on. And these became objects of popular devotion, statues of Buddha, actually taking somewhat after the trends in Buddhism. So now, yes?
Is there any proof that he actually existed?
Is there any proof that he actually existed? I think historians accept that he existed because even though the early histories are not what we would call scientific historiography, but there's so much agreement that I think.
So many people have accounts that
Yeah. So I think it would be a little trying too hard to be skeptical to say it didn't exist. Yes?
Has anyone done anything like carbon dating all these relics and stupas and stuff?
Relics. There are debates over dating, and everyone is in the same ballpark, basically, approximately 2,400, 2,500 years ago. So again, it's like the the odd thing, like the Da Vinci Code. We won't get into the accuracy or gross inaccuracy of that stuff. But the Da Vinci Code, at least the way I understand, the whole point was that they're hiding this artifact because it could show that Jesus begot a child. The problem is we don't have any DNA from Jesus. So even if you found, for example, Mary Magdalene and saw that she had had a child, since there's no Jesus DNA, you'd never know he was the father. So anyway, we don't really know about Buddha, but yeah, I think he definitely did exist. Now, there's a famous story that he was a prince. He was a prince living in a region, the Shakya region. Actually, Shakya, or Shaka's sort of Sanskrit for the Scythians. These people came from Central Asia originally, near the border of Nepal and India, sort of northeast India. And his father apparently was a prince or a community leader or something. And what the Buddhism book we have says is that a simple, poignant story, unlikely to be true in the literal sense, it's very hard to believe that Buddha was as naive as the story portrays. In other words, can you really be born in the real world and you grow up in a town and you get married and you even have a kid and you actually don't know that people get old, become diseased, and die? Anyway, that's what's hard to believe. But that's the story somehow. Maybe it didn't strike him. Maybe he just didn't think about it. I think it's very easy to believe that someone could grow up and just not worry about it. Like, let's not talk about death and let's not talk about those things. And a lot of people do actually live in a sort of little bubble where they don't talk about it, they don't think about it. And it is possible to have a sudden shocking experience where it comes home to you. Oh my God, I'm mortal. I'm vulnerable. So if that happens all the time, that is a fairly common psychology. And it seems like, to be honest, it's more likely that he just had a very powerful experience and it really, for the first time, hit him, his own mortality, and that this world is really kind of there's a lot of suffering here. And you read again and again and again when you read specialized books on Buddhism, that the essence of it, the real point, the central message was suffering. It's about suffering, about how this world is miserable. And of course, you don't stop there, but that really was at the core of the message. So whether he knew it before or not, at a certain point, as a young adult, married, it hit him. It really struck him, and it struck him so hard that he gave up everything and took off. Like, I'm out of here. Now, as we discussed earlier, there already was a Shramana movement. In other words, Buddha or Siddhartha did not invent this idea. It's not like it never occurred to anyone to dump everything and head for the hills. There was already you could say a countercultural group. There was already a pattern, which was a little countercultural, but a lot of people did it. It's like I remember back when I did my undergraduate work in the late 60s in Berkeley, California, actually right in the middle of the whole thing. And I remember there were so many runaway kids, so many young people, I guess about your age or younger, ran away from home back then that there was a sort of a community newspaper in Berkeley called the Berkeley Barb. That was the paper put out by the young radical people. And half the paper was just ads, paid advertisements from parents like, Johnny, please come home, we forgive you, And literally half the newspaper was advertising, paid ads from parents trying to find their kids. Parents from all around the country. So it was, and of course they all came through Berkeley. Berkeley was an obligatory stop on the journey. So the idea was that leaving everything and going off into nature to find yourself, to find the truth, already was a pattern. That was a Shramana thing. And so Siddhartha Gautama, he opted for that. And one of the most famous claims about early Buddhism is that Buddha chose or discovered and then taught the middle path. The middle path. That's a big soundbite in the history of Buddhism. And the middle path is between what never mind the Sanskrit. What you call in trying to enjoy the world, trying to exploit the world, and trying to totally reject the world. In other words, Buddha, or Siddhartha, in his youth, apparently lived in the lap of luxury. I mean, whatever that meant. 2,500 years ago, in the foothills of the Himalayan mountains, they didn't have washing machines or motorcycles or even computers or cell phones. But whatever they did have, at least the story goes, Buddha had it. And the idea was, in the first part of his life, he was trying to enjoy the world. He had this attitude like, let me get my hands on the world. I want to enjoy the world. In a civilized way. I mean, apparently, he was a faithful husband and he had a kid and all that. So then, having found that there's just frustration, I can't really be happy trying to enjoy the world, trying to exploit the world, then he tried the other extreme. Let me just totally give up the world. Performing severe austerities. Like, there's all kinds of descriptions in the ancient Indian literature. This is a very, very common theme. Ferocious, like frightening austerities where, like for 1 month, he only ate leaves that fell from trees. Like, if you actually reach for a leaf and pluck it off a tree, that's kind of hedonistic. So you have to wait till the leaf falls off the tree, and then you can eat it. And then the next month he decided, no, I really want to give up the world, so he only drank water for a month. And even then, forget it. So the next month, third month, he only ate air, sort of breathed in air. And then the fourth month he stopped breathing and suspended his breath in yoga. So there's this whole pattern. There's stories like this that cut across different traditions. You find these in many different Hindu or Vedic traditions. And so Buddha got into these very severe austerities. In the Mahabharata, as I've said, I don't know how many times I'm going to say this before you ask me to stop, but I'm working on the Mahabharata, this great text we'll talk about, and Arjuna, the great Arjuna, who heard the Bhagavad Gita from Krishna thousands of years ago, he apparently went to heaven to get special weapons to come back and save the world. And we'll talk about that. And so when he on his way to heaven, he performed these severe austerities, just as I'm describing, like the first month, only leaves falling from trees and so on. So then Buddha realized, no, this isn't it either. This isn't the way, because if you just... Now remember Mahavir, who apparently starved himself to death, the Jain. This is, of course, the Jains and the Buddhists were very close at this point. They went head to head. They were direct competition. They were directly competing with each other. And so just as the Jains idealized renunciation, the great renouncers, the ascetics, Buddha also tried that, this extreme self-abnegation, and finally concluded, nope, that's not it either. And so then he found the middle path where you don't try to enjoy the world, you don't literally kill yourself with austerities, but you meditate and try to get wisdom. So that's sort of the middle path. And that's a constant thing that later Buddhists like Nagarjuna, for example, and other people, whenever there's a Buddhist, or often when they're trying to reform Buddhism, centuries later, like, we've strayed from our roots, this is not what Buddha really taught, they'll always claim you have to go back to the middle path. There's another way in which they will understand the middle path, which is not at all clear that Buddha really taught, and that's a major issue we'll talk about at length, is that all the claims, all the conflicting, contradictory claims that this is what Buddha really taught. So let's go into a bit of that. Any questions so far? No? Okay, yes.
Can you explain the etymology of shramana again?
Oh, shram. There's the Sanskrit root shram, which means either to toil, labor, exhaust yourself. It can also mean to strive for something in a positive sense. And then in Sanskrit, you can make a neuter noun out of a verb by adding the ending anam. And so shamanam means doing all that stuff. And therefore it comes to mean a devotee, a practitioner, so on. And generally they sometimes take the ending off when they, popularize Sanskrit, so the shamanas. Yes?
The book also takes out the R. Is that the same term?
Yeah, remember I told you about the Brooklyn accent? Because, for example, you imagine in Brooklyn, like someone asking you what your dharma is, dharma, and saying, what's your dharma? Like the Northeast accent, also in Boston, so that's what it becomes in Pali, dharma. Your dharma. So shamana becomes shamana. So dropping the R's, that's a feature of Northeast English. Yes?
Does this refer to is renouncer movement and shamana the same thing?
The Shramana movements generally were renouncer movements. Even Buddha, despite the claims of the middle path, was definitely a renouncer. I mean, he gave up his home, he gave up all kinds of things. So the Shramana movements generally, we're back to nature, give up the luxuries of the city, and try to figure out what's really up, literally. So, now what did Buddha really teach? Here are some problems in trying to figure out what Buddha really taught. Here's a quote from our book, Buddhism book, page 27. Buddha advised that each person should think for himself. Of course, this is a report on what Buddha taught, so we have to believe that he really taught that, but apparently he did. Each person should think for himself, or herself, obviously, on matters of doctrine. In keeping with Buddha's advice, there never arose a central source of authority in Buddhism on matters of doctrine. No institution or body authorized to promulgate dogmas and creeds for the religion as a whole. Now, soon after the historical Siddhartha Gautama passed away into nirvana, wherever he went, there were at least 18 different Buddhist schools. And one of the reasons is, because this freedom of doctrine. Now, contrast this with the history of Christianity, which was very concerned about doctrine. If you look at the great wars, literally physical wars in Christianity over doctrine, the 300s of this era were extremely critical in the great, that's a whole, you give a whole course on that. The great war, literally, theological and physical. military over the Trinity doctrine. And who is the historical Jesus, and what did he really teach, and the Arianism versus the Trinitarianism, and so on. So doctrine. So we have kind of this concept from the West that religions really go to the mat over doctrine, because the history of Western Christianity is a history of a very brutal struggles over sometimes very subtle points of theology. Whereas the first great schisms in Buddhism were not over theology. They were over monastic practice. Like what time should you get up in the morning, and how austere do you have to be, and how many times are you allowed to eat, and things like that. So a point that I'll gradually be developing in the several lectures, or 3 lectures we'll have on Buddhism, is that Buddha, I think you could argue, essentially taught a type of mystic or metaphysical psychology. That Buddha's real concern was to get people into a state of consciousness. He was not teaching so much ontology. If you know that word ontology, it means a branch of philosophy that concerns itself, ontology, like a lot of O's in it, that concerns itself with the nature of existence, like metaphysics, that which lies beyond the physical. Is there a soul? Is there not a soul? Is there a God? What is the nature of existence? So because Buddhism grew in India, which was a civilization which was intellectually increasingly sophisticated and increasingly concerned with questions like that, and the Buddhists had to compete, so they started to attempt to derive all kinds of doctrines on metaphysics, the soul and God, or no God, or the nature of matter, and so on. But the overwhelming evidence, I believe, to the extent that we have any evidence, is that Buddha was teaching with more concern with states of consciousness, trying to get you into a certain state of mind, and not really commenting on the actual, philosophical nature of existence. And that's what one of our little books said, published by Oxford, that he stressed everybody should think for himself. In other words, if you get into the right state of consciousness, his 4 noble truths, we should mention that right away. The first one is you're suffering. It's like, wake up, people, you're suffering. You may think you're enjoying because you've got money or a house on a hill, or you drive a very fancy skateboard or whatever. But actually, you're suffering. You're really suffering, and if you want to, in order to stop, and you can, how should I put this? The reason you're suffering, the reason you're suffering is because you're selfish. I mean, it's something anyone can experience for themselves. Like in our most selfish moments, we're not really like serene, at peace, love the world, goodwill toward everybody. I mean, selfishness makes you kind of nervous and kind of shrinks your consciousness. And so Buddha said that we're suffering because we're selfish. Want to be happy? Stop being selfish. Want to stop being selfish? Live right. You have to live right. You have to live the proper kind of life, which means like right thinking, right conduct, right everything, and so on. Those are the 4 noble truths. You're miserable. That's because you're selfish. You can stop being selfish and therefore stop suffering. To do that, you have to live the proper life. Those are the 4 noble truths. Now, if you did that, if you could really stop being selfish, you realize you're suffering, and you could stop being selfish and live a disciplined life, hey, that's fine. And you like Buddha, then you're a Buddhist. Now, what is the nature of the universe? And is there a soul? And what is this and what is that? Just realize you're suffering, stop being selfish, live a proper disciplined life. That was it. But later, all this philosophy came out. And it's very, well, there are serious questions about to what extent this philosophy really was taught, by the historical Buddha. And I'll give a very amazing example of that. First, one more quote, then I want to get to the Buddha's sermons, actually read from the Buddha's sermons. What becomes of a Buddha? I mean, eventually the idea became that you can become a Buddha, because the Sanskrit word Buddha means the awakened one or enlightened one. So you can become a Buddha or an Arhat, from another Sanskrit root meaning a worthy one, an Arhat or a Buddha. So what becomes of a Buddha or Arhat at death? It's like you do the whole program. You buy in, sign up, go through this whole discipline. What do you get? It's like the end of all the game shows, like tell her what she's won. So what did you win if you do the whole Buddhist program? Well, it's not clear. It is in connection with final nirvana that problems of understanding arise. When the flame of craving is extinguished, rebirth ceases, and an enlightened person is not reborn, what happened to him or her? this emphasis mine. There is no clear answer to this question in the early sources. Because as I explained before, the word nirvana is grammatically negative. Nir is a prefix in Sanskrit meaning without. And vana is a word, actually, since you're all interested, right? It's van anam. It's the same sort of form, the same way as this shaman. Without vana, nirvana means vana less, no vana. It's a negative concept. So positively, where do you go? What happens? That's not clear.
What's vana?
Vana, current, like the flow or the current, like from that verb you have like vayur vati, the wind blows. So like the blowing of the wind, the flowing of a stream, any sort of current of energy.
So nirvana one means to stop.
The current of birth and death.
Okay.
Yeah, samsara, repeated birth and death. Yes?
So I think it's just kind of like stating it's obvious, like nobody really knows, rather than just taking like blindly believing whatever doctrine you want to believe. Like,
Well, it's not at all clear. It's not obvious to me that everyone that has a positive doctrine is blind. It's not obvious to me, based on my life experience, to be honest, and just based on my thinking, that anyone who feels they have to have some kind of experience of positive spiritual thing, like a soul or a God, is blind, therefore, that only blind people would imagine such a thing. In fact, we'll find that as Buddhism progresses, Mahayana Buddhism, we'll talk all about this, which becomes, today it's 85% of all the Buddhists in the world, it's the big winner in all these schisms within Buddha. They talk about heavens and going to heaven. There were very early Buddhist schools that talked about a soul. So, in fact, this Mahayana Buddhism ridiculed the early Buddhism, saying that Buddha's first disciples were kind of numbskulls, and therefore he just gave them very simple things, and the real Buddhist teachings came later. So this very Spartan, very austere, no one really knows. I mean, if you say no one really knows, the only way you could say that would be if you knew. Like if I give, let's say I ask you a question, and I say no one here knows the right answer, that means I know the right answer. Only a person that knows the right answer can claim that nobody else knows the right answer. So the claim that no one really knows is actually an extremely ambitious claim. Because if you say nobody knows, what you're really saying is nobody but me knows. Because if you also don't know, you don't know who else knows or doesn't know. Like, for example, let's say there's a question on the board. It could be in the realm of math or anything. And I say, I don't know the answer. Well, how do I know you don't know? I can only know you don't know if I do know the answer, or if I believe I know the answer. So saying nobody knows is never say never. It leads immediately to fatal contradictions.
so I think that was like his point. I mean, if you believe the...
Well, why don't we read the Buddha's second sermon? You can judge for yourself. Because Buddha actually, and this is the interesting thing, did not deny the existence of a soul and did not deny the existence of a God. His followers went beyond him. And you find the same thing in Shankara, the great Vedantist, who came actually over 1,000 years later, and perhaps the most famous Hindu philosopher of history. And we find that his followers were more radical than him. We find the followers of Jesus made claims that Jesus didn't make about Jesus. In fact, by the end of the 300s in Europe, it became a serious crime, at times a capital crime, to claim that we should understand Jesus according to the statements about Jesus made by Jesus. In other words, Jesus, this is a whole other topic, of course, but Jesus made many statements saying in which he claimed he was subordinate to God. He came to serve God. So because of the Trinity doctrine, by the end of the 300s, if you claimed that Jesus, when he spoke about himself, was telling the truth, that became a serious crime. So also in the case of, I will read you Buddha's second sermon, which is the sermon on the non-existence of the self. You can judge for yourself if he's really saying that. So the Buddha discouraged speculation about the nature of nirvana and emphasized instead the need to strive for its attainment. And nirvana does include positive elements, and we'll talk about that. That's why that word's on the board. I better get to you very soon. Anyway, so why don't I get to that right now, so I don't run out of time and lose this game show episode. So there are sermons that Buddha is claimed to have given, and the claim is made even within the tradition, these are the exact words of the Buddha, and of course historians wonder about it. But anyway, these are very important claims within Buddhist tradition. So to make sure I have time for it, why don't I just jump to the second one. This is the second sermon. Buddha, basically, he tried to enjoy life as a prince or the son of a community leader or something. And then he gives that up. He jumps into the sort of Shramana wave. He goes off and he goes to the other extreme. He tries to totally deny enjoyment, totally give up the world. He realizes that extreme also is too radical. He comes to what he feels the middle path. He's found it. He's found his Four Noble Truths, and now he's ready to start teaching. So he comes to a deer park near the city of Benares in India, on the Ganges River, still to this day a very famous city, in ancient times called Kashi. And he comes to this deer park and he sees some of his old meditation buddies, because when he was trying other forms of realization that didn't quite work for him, he had some, there were other shramanas that he was meditating with. And so he comes back to the deer park and sees them, and they say, "Hey, Siddhartha, how you doing, buddy?" And he says, like, "Don't call me that. I am now the enlightened one." Which doesn't sound like the real, it doesn't sound like an enlightened, egoless Buddha. It very much sounds like what followers would say about him, because I've studied these things. I have a lot of experience of this, that it's often the followers that insist on their leader being put on a very high pedestal, even if the leader would rather be humble. And so you have statements, well, I lied, I am reading the first sermon. Anyway, when they first come, they say, "Hey, friend, Gautam." Like, "Hey, old buddy." And he says, "Do not call the Tathagata by his name nor address him as friend," which is a very friendly way to greet your old friends. Tathagata means the one who has thus come. For he is the Buddha, the Holy One. No God or soul, but there is holiness. The Buddha looks with the kind heart equally on all that he... In other words, I think he was probably a lot more relaxed and down to earth. But later you get these stories. I think he's probably a nice guy. And just talk to them. Anyway, so there's the first sermon, which he teaches his noble truths. Now here's the second sermon, which is very famous in Buddhist tradition. This is the sermon on the non-existence of the soul. No self, no soul. But this is what Buddha actually says. It's short. I'll read it to you. Well, first, on the fifth day, after he arrived at the deer park, the Buddha delivered his second sermon. It is known in Buddhist literature as the sermon on the non-existence of the soul. Here it is. O monks, the body cannot be considered a soul because it is liable to destruction. So, we're going to go for a little checklist here. These are all called skandhas, these 5 Sanskrit words, which means something like, in this context, a layer, or something like a layer covering. So what Buddha is saying is that in our ordinary life, day-to-day, kind of mindless, going about your life, we take the body to be the self. Like, here I am this body. And so Buddha is saying, as practically all the great teachers in ancient India said, no, this body is just a covering. It's just a covering. It's not really you. It's just a machine. It's a vehicle. This isn't really you. There's a very ancient analogy. The body is just a vehicle. So Buddha first says rupa. Rupa literally means form, visible form, which would be the visible body. And then he says, the body cannot be considered a soul because there's liable destruction. Sensation, the next one. In other words, just your sensations, perceptions, predispositions, which is translation for samskara, if you know yoga jargon, like your deep psychology, your deep conditioning, your deep predispositions, psychological predispositions, perception, inclination, and consciousness. They're all transitory consciousness, which is vijnana. Sankhya, which is translated perception, is not a great translation because in Sanskrit the word sankhya is often used to mean a definition. So what I think Buddha is saying, if he's just speaking, using the same language everybody else uses at the time, is that our tendency to categorize everything, put everything in boxes, this is a this is a that, to see the world very categorically and analytically, that's not ultimately who we are. There's a holistic, higher understanding. And then vijnana, which is sort of like your experience of what the world is, your insights into the nature of this world. So Buddha is saying none of these are the self, because they change or transitory. Is it permanent? Are not the sensation, perception, inclination, and consciousness transitory? Are they permanent, etc., etc.? And that which is transitory, is it evil or good? And that which is transitory, evil. In other words, the obvious answer was it's evil. And that which is transitory, evil, and liable to change, can it be ever considered as this is mine or this I am? In other words, it's not really mine and it's not really me because it changes. It's temporary. It's fleeting. I cannot think that any of these things are my eternal soul. Then, O monks, all physical form, whether past, present, or future, whether subjective or objective, far or near, high or low, should be rightfully regarded as this is not I. So all physical forms, it's not really me. This is not mine. This is not my eternal soul. In like manner, all sensation, perception, the whole other list. These are not mine, these are not I, these are not my eternal soul. Knowing thus, O monks, a true disciple will develop an aversion to the physical form, the sensation, you become averse to the whole list. Thereby, the monk overcomes desire, becomes freed, and having become freed, realizes that becoming, in other words, things which didn't exist and then come into existence and then pass away. So the world of becoming, as opposed to permanent things, is exhausted. That one has lived a pure life, one has done what was expected of him, and has done away with mortality forever. The end. That's all, folks. No statement that there's no soul. No statement there's no God. That is the sermon which later Buddhists took to be the sermon on the non-existence of the soul, which Buddha never states. He simply says, these things are not the soul. Now, even in Christian theology and in general Western philosophy, there's a very famous method called the via negativa, which the negative way, which means that if you take away everything which is not the truth, all that is left is the truth. It's not a denial of positive truth. It's simply a technique. For example, let's say you have water, which is contaminated. If you remove everything which is not water, pure water, what are you left with? Pure water. So this is obviously the via negativa, which is also in the Upanishads. It's called, because the same technique was used in the Upanishads, that we're not denying the soul or God. Neti, neti, which literally means no, like nothing. The iti at the end means unquote. So that's it. That's the teaching. Now, as we'll see next time, there were very important, very successful Buddhist groups in ancient India that claimed there was a soul. And they claimed they were following Buddha, the Udgalapadas. And eventually Mahayana Buddhism will claim, and we'll talk much more about this, that the highest stage of Buddhahood is to become a bodhisattva, which means out of compassion, out of personal compassion for other living beings, you come back again and again to this world and help people. Now, if you don't exist and they don't exist, what is that all about? That you have to be compassionate on them and help them out of your love for them. So, Buddhism, by the way, as we talked about last time, stressed nonviolence, stressed compassion. Like Jainism, one should be kind to all creatures, and so on. So, just one more point I want to get in. They also accepted karma. This is a very important, that was the whole point, to stop karma. The vana is the vana of karma, samsara. And yet, if there's no person, if there's no self, who gets the karma? How is there individual moral responsibility? How is there individual moral responsibility if there's no person? If you didn't do it. And also, there's one quote which I'll probably read next Monday, right? Where in one of our books, these are books written by specialists, they say that acceptance of some kind of continuing personal existence seems to be a minimum qualification for Buddhist teaching. So again, this non-existence of the self, what Buddha actually is claiming is that these coverings of the self, and finally, the last thing, if you look at these words here, Sangya, G-N-A, J-N-A, Sam is just a prefix, and here we have another prefix, Vi. So we have Vijnana, Sangyana, or Sangyana. Gya, as I explained before, is the Sanskrit word to know, and it's cognate with the Greek gnosis. And so in Buddhism, prajna, if you just put a different prefix, if you have before this ya, which means knowing, if you have a v prefix or a some prefix, it's a bad thing. It's one of the evil temporary coverings. In other words, it's a layer of consciousness which is not the deepest consciousness. But all you need to do is slip in this new prefix, pra, P-R-A, and if you get prajna, it becomes the great ideal of Buddhism. Wisdom. This is nirvana. And there's all kinds of, there are dozens and dozens, not hundreds of Buddhist books, sort of like Buddhism for Dummies from ancient times, in which they even use this in the title, prajna. So to translate this as one of the coverings of consciousness, therefore nirvana means, kill consciousness, like Kill Bill, is obviously not it, because the same word jha, consciousness, with a different prefix, meaning a different kind of consciousness, becomes the ultimate goal of Buddhism. So these ideas, no self, no consciousness, are really, they can be quite misleading. And so next week we're going to talk about what happened after Buddha, and where Buddhism really went, and stuff like that. Did you have a quick question?
So Buddhism does that, describe what, who we are, and do we have a soul,
Well, later, you see, the followers, some followers of Buddha became extremely aggressive in arguing there's no soul. There's actually no soul. And so that became a wing of Buddhism, but not all of Buddhism. So, one more minute, yes?
Did Buddhists stress vegetarianism or less?
They did. I mean, they were very strict about it. Things like the Jains, but then they kind of sort of modified it. Well, if someone hands me a hamburger, just, accept it. So, anyway, we'll talk more about this on Monday. Have a good weekend.